most watched news in Western Washington. King 5 News at 10:30 starts now.
Remember that registered sex offender who stole the Victoria Clipper from the Seattle waterfront?
The King 5 investigators have found that he cut off his GPS tracking bracelet 4 times, including right before that heist. Chris Ingalls reveals how the case raises troubling questions about the GPS tracking systems the state uses to keep a leash on its most dangerous ex-cons.
As we sit here right now, what is your status?
My status is fugitive of the law.
25-year-old Red is free to meet us in this park, free to wander, even though the eyes of the law believe they're on him at all times.
It just felt like a joke.
A joke, he says, that was looped around his ankle until he decided to snap it off.
Actually, lo and behold, all it took was a simple push and the device broke. This is the mount.
Red says more than a week after he removed the GPS tracking device placed on his ankle at a local jail.
I'm not a tagged animal.
The law doesn't seem to notice that he's made a home detention jailbreak. Did anybody call to check up on you? Did anybody question whether your equipment was working?
No. Something just clicked in my head that realized, like, why am I playing this game?
Red is not a hardcore criminal, but the state of Washington uses the same type of GPS tracking to keep tabs on its most dangerous and unpredictable ex-cons, about 200 at any given time.
So this is what your field officer, your CCO, would see when they go to monitor their offenders.
GPS software tells a community corrections officer, CCO, if the device is giving a good signal and if the offender is where he should be.
The green gives a good indication that everything is okay.
If it's not okay, or if the offender cuts the bracelet off, the dot turns red, and the CCO gets an alert detailing the problem.
So when you have a strap violation, that means
Mac Peavy runs the program for the Department of Corrections.
I think the system works really well. We've seen a lot of adherence to the program. We've gained a lot of compliance from offenders. It's increased accountability for offenders.
Where are you trying to go?
Samuel McDonough cut off his GPS bracelet and made the most memorable heist of 2013. His theft of the Victoria Clipper because he wanted to sail to Canada played almost like a comedy, but there are no laughs in McDonough's backstory.
He's gotten worse in his behavior, so that frightens me.
His mother says while on GPS monitoring, he was using meth and carrying a knife he claimed for self-defense.
He sleeps here on the floor, and he had a machete he put under his pillow, so I was getting concerned.
Department of Corrections records show McDonough often let his GPS battery die, and he cut off 4 GPS bracelets during 6 months on the program. Often a few days would pass before DOC realized McDonough was untethered. A high-level corrections official complained, somehow we need to ensure we know about the lost or removed GPS units in an email written after the Clipper theft.
We're following up on that. I'm not sure where we're at. I know that's a continuing investigation.
Then there's the troubling thing that happened on this Capitol Hill street corner 3 months before the Clipper theft. McDonough was arrested because he fit the description of a man who grabbed a woman by the arm.
Police reports say he told her he was following her and stated he hadn't had sex in a while. McDonough was never charged, but DOC jailed him for 20 days for letting his GPS battery die before the incident.
He just doesn't like the thing on his ankle.
Records show that even if an offender is in compliance, a GPS device can send out dozens, even hundreds of alerts in a month. John Callahan spent more than 2 decades in prison for molesting 8 children. Last August, his GPS sent 293 alerts that he entered places he wasn't supposed to go. The following month, even more, 372 alerts. DOC says Callahan's homelessness made him a challenge.
A lot of those alerts were largely because he was charging his device, like, for example, at a Barnes & Noble, a place where, yeah, he was prohibited in being, but he needed to charge his device, too. So part of that is part and parcel is having that follow-up conversation with him to say, where were you, what were you doing?
But the system is also prone to false alarms and blind spots.
It had a lot of errors, I'll tell you, and I paid the price for that. It has flaws.
This level 2 sex offender told us false alerts from his GPS got him sent to jail, partly because it didn't work in blind spots at his home.
I don't think they're that worthwhile at all, really.
It isn't just the word of a felon. Last year, the LA Times uncovered a corrections report warning that the public is in imminent danger because GPS units on thousands of California cons are so faulty. Those devices were made by 3M, the same company that Washington State uses and which California dumped last year.
3M and the product that we've been using, we found has had great results.
Something that kind of just happened.
Since this interview, Red has turned himself into the Fife Police Department, which was supposed to be monitoring his GPS unit.
I know that there are other people like me that are circumventing this.
Good evening. A sex offender tries to kidnap a girl in a Seattle park.
King 5 has learned that records from his GPS tracking device show he'd visited the off-limits park in the past. King 5's Chris Ingalls is live at Benefit Park with more on that, plus an exclusive interview with a 6-year-old victim. Chris.
Dennis, the reason the state puts satellite tracking devices on 200 of its most high-risk ex-cons, mostly sex offenders, is to keep them out of places like this one, Benefit Park on Beacon Hill. Records show that Jesse Brisbane, a level 3 sex offender who lived just down the street from here, may have been testing the waters before he made his move on a little girl.
An underdog. I'm not doing an underdog.
It's not easy for 6-year-old Taylor Fletcher to come back here.
You think you can go as high as the tree, my love?
Even with her mother by her side, it's hard not to think of the man who approached her in Benefit Park 2 weeks ago.
And he was already standing kind of next to her, so he grabbed her arm and then pulled her.
Police say this was the man who got more than 3 blocks with Taylor before he was stopped by her family and neighbors. Registered sex offender Jesse Brisbane allegedly offered her money first and then got physical.
Got in the hand. So after all this, what can you say that you have learned? What have you learned from this experience? How can we prevent this?
I learned not to talk to strangers.
Brisbane was wearing a GPS anklet, a satellite tracking device that's supposed to send an alert to parole officers if he enters a park or other places where children are found.
He was so calculated. He was watching our kids. So I think he really just took his time to watch the patterns of the neighborhood.
We've learned that Brisbane has had problems at this very park before. Department of Corrections records show that his GPS device has alerted at least twice here in recent months.
A January alert shows he cruised by the park, perhaps on a bus or bike. It's unclear if parole officers warned him about getting too close to the park. Records from the parole officer's log also show a GPS violation at Benefit Play Area that occurred 3 weeks later. The device showed him at the park for about 2 minutes. Vernay Fletcher says that was about all the time he needed with her little girl.
From the start of him getting off the bus to the end of their conversation, him leaving was about 2 minutes, 2, maybe 3.
Vernay says Brisbane approached 3 of her older children at the edge of the park a month ago. There's no record of an alert for that in DOC documents, but the agency says it is reviewing Brisbane's case. He's in jail now, charged with kidnapping, in a case that many people have agreed could have turned out much worse.
I'm hoping by us talking about this openly that little kids will be, proactive, and if they see somebody, they'll know it is okay to scream.
So DOC says it's not going to talk about this because it is an active investigation right now. Our ongoing series of investigations called Home Free has raised questions about the effectiveness of these electronic monitoring programs that are used so widely to keep watch on criminals. It's an issue that state lawmakers will be talking about when they get together for a work session on Monday, and Vernay says she just might be there to tell lawmakers her family story and the close call.
A teenager murdered by a sex offender wearing a GPS tracking bracelet. At the time, authorities hailed the high-tech evidence that put the killer at the scene of the crime. But a review of the case by the King 5 investigators unearths evidence never before made public. It raises questions about whether that same technology could have prevented the crime. Chris Ingalls looks at the dangerous sex offender who went home free and the family that paid the price.
An unremarkable Saturday near Vancouver, Washington, turned into the day that would horrify the community of Hazel Dell. Walking down these streets after visiting Walmart, 13-year-old Alicia Nip never made it home.
She was the only niece I had.
Her aunt remembers hoping the happy-go-lucky teen called Lissy was playing a joke on her family.
She was always dancing all over the place and doing silly things and laughing and smiling.
Alicia took this shortcut through the woods, even though it was a known haven for the homeless and drug addicts. Her family found Lissy's lifeless body in the vegetation the next morning, February 22nd of 2009.
Her dad had found her. It was like being hit in the chest. I loved that little girl tremendously. She was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful little thing.
detectives and news crews fanned out. Among those interviewed was a homeless man who lived in the woods, Darren Sanford.
Did you see any suspicious activity around here on Saturday about 5 o'clock?
Nope, negative.
Were you around here at that time?
Off and on, yeah.
But Sanford must have known his hours of freedom were numbered. A GPS transmitter on his ankle put him at the exact time and location of Lissy's murder. I have to say the GPS is quite amazing, wrote one official from the Department of Corrections about the technology used to crack the case. DOC had placed the tracking device on Darren Sanford for the challenging job of trying to monitor a homeless sex offender who scored the highest possible risk to reoffend on assessment tests. Alone in the woods, Lissy came face to face with Sanford.
I've always assumed it was kind of a random thing, but we don't really know for sure.
But the crime wasn't random at all. Sanford had met Lissy several months earlier at the one place he was not supposed to be, his sister's apartment. Sanford was banned from apartment number 11 and had even gone to jail in 2008 for hanging out with minors here in violation of court orders. But that didn't stop him from coming back to see friends of his sister's young son who liked Sanford, including 13-year-old Alicia Knipp. Records reviewed by King 5 don't explain if Lissy went into the woods on her last day with the intention of seeing Sanford.
Maybe he wore a mask that day and she had no idea what the monster she was dealing with.
Internal DOC records show that only after Lissy's murder did parole officers examine Sanford's GPS movements to determine that Sanford continued to visit and frequent the location where minors were known to congregate, including Lissy. And Sanford had been visiting his sister's apartment over the last few days, including the weekend of the killing. But his parole officers apparently missed the clues transmitted by his tracking bracelet.
It seems like there's a possibility they could have caught him and stopped this crime.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, it makes me very angry that if that didn't have to happen, that it happened.
Good evening. Lawmakers are pledging to make changes following a series of King 5 investigations.
They're talking about new laws to crack down on criminals who are supposed to be on home detention but are actually going home free. Chris Ingalls is live at the Criminal Justice Training Center in Burien, where the State House of Representatives Public Safety Committee met this afternoon. Chris?
Yeah, Mimi, this is a place that preaches law and order, so perhaps it's fitting that lawmakers came here today. They agree there aren't many laws and there's plenty of disorder in the way this state monitors electronically criminals.
This is State of Washington versus Jesse Richard Brisbane.
This morning, high-risk sex offender Jesse Brisbane pleaded not guilty to kidnapping. He's accused of grabbing the 6-year-old at a Seattle park 2 weeks ago. A bold move considering the level 3 sex offender was wearing a GPS transmitter on his ankle at the time of the crime.
Not being reported at all.
Just a few hours after Brisbane's court appearance, state lawmakers met for this work session.
There are a lot of concerns that offenders are getting away with supposedly being monitored, but actually being free to go and do whatever they want, unaccountable.
This work group is looking at Washington's loose rules surrounding electronic monitoring of criminals by public agencies and even private companies that make up their own rules.
The judge says you're going to be on home monitoring, but the judge oftentimes doesn't know what that means. And we verified that by calling many judges around the state and asking them what it means, and it varied a lot jurisdiction by jurisdiction and judge to judge.
That means criminals who are supposed to be under close watch are on the loose.
The group watched an excerpt from Home Free, our investigative series that showed a man accused of killing his friend and stuffing him into a shopping cart after being released on home detention. A man who peeled off his tracking bracelet undetected. And this man, whose monitoring company allowed him to take trips to the beach and bar while serving a home detention sentence. Representatives from the electronic monitoring industry were also at today's meeting.
I think most of us do a very honorable job of monitoring people and reporting.
But lawmakers say most isn't good enough.
We are working in a bipartisan way to regulate the home monitoring industry much better, and we will have legislation in the next session.
Just one example of something lawmakers can do, they can pass new licensing requirements and standards for the home monitoring industry. Right now, for example, a criminal could run one of these monitoring companies. There are no background checks, so you would essentially have a criminal monitoring criminals. Lawmakers say that has got to change.